Well, hello. I'm actually doing a standalone recording this week, kind of changing the formatting a little bit for the podcast because I really love to do it live in the Discord server, but I'm also finding that there's just a lot of different issues that are arising when I have outside voices, including legal issues that I just don't have the bandwidth for right now. So taking this week off, and we'll return to the Discord server next week, hopefully on the event stage. And that will kind of hopefully be the best of both worlds. But we left off with a really charming topic last week. So we're still in chapter 3, and we're looking at right view. And right now we are on, it's funny, as I said that I looked over to the PDF I'm looking at, and here there was the word wrong views. And yes, that is indeed where we left off, at the top of page 120. The Eightfold Path, 8 rights, right view. But here, Buddha has some things to say about wrong view, because as will continue to come up, and has already come up, we're cultivating a lot of things lest our fabricated kind of state take over, right? So we're not just cultivating right view, but we're also refraining from cultivating wrong views. And again, these words right and wrong, right? I'm sure they're very charged. Last week talking about Shenpa, everybody's got their thing. I did not grow up in and please forgive me for anyone who is religious, because I have great respect. I also recognize that in my country and where I live, and a lot of the people who have been in my sphere throughout my life have also been damaged by what humans and human folly tends to do with their book sometimes. So I realize that sometimes right and wrong can be kind of cringy words for people. So again, I just try to keep my mind kind of at the beginner's level, can I just kind of keep my mind open here? So last week we started with the first one listed here in Bhikkhu's book here, annihilationism, and again, and as last week was truly, the last time I can include a community voice member in a podcast because it doesn't live in the Discord server. But, we discussed, how difficult some of these ideas are, just how really difficult it is to kind of grapple with or cognate and really kind of come to, I guess, air quotes, believe in annihilationism as it pertains to the idea of rebirth, right? Because that is the larger section that we're on. Because, right, last week, Buddha says annihilationism, this idea that if you believe that there is nothing else, that's wrong view. So really bold claim, right? So for people like me and many, many, many people that I know, and from what I can tell from a lot of research, a growing number of people, he would say that on a certain level, we hold wrong view. In other words, we hold wrong view if we think this is it. And again, I'm not going to make any comments on that because what am I going to say about that? It comes back to... I think we're starting to get it now. I think psychologists are starting to get it now. We're starting to get it now. Humans, when I say we're, Homo sapien is starting to get it now. That it's not reality that's subjective, it's perspective that's subjective. Right? So and again, this came up in chapters earlier or sections earlier, whatever, where, Buddha's talking about, well, can you prove it? Do you have evidence? And he's like, well, no. And that's when it gets dicey, right? That's when it gets dicey, because then it just becomes about your word. Well, I had an experience. Well, bully for you, right? There's an old-fashioned word for you that you can look up. Bully for you. You had an experience. Whoop-a-doo! So But right, there are going to be those individuals out there who, sure, you had an experience, okay, right? And anyway, I don't want to spend all this time on this because I'm doing a standalone and I'm going to take advantage of this puppy. And I am going to get into this, this uncomfortable chapter for me. This has always been the juicy gems that challenge my view, that challenge what I think or what I believe to think that I know about what happens to the package when it ceases to be kicking around on this ball. All right, so we're going to move on from annihilationism now and get into materialism. Materialism is a subset of annihilationism. It holds not only that a person is made of material elements that will be annihilated at death, but also that while alive, those elements are in no position to know an unconditioned dimension. In addition, it holds that because causality is purely mechanical, with both the agent and the recipients of action nothing more than material elements, there is no inherent moral quality to actions. The judgment that an action is good or bad is simply a matter of convention. The moral quality of an intention has no bearing on the pleasure or pain that the action resulting from that intention might produce for the person doing it. At present, materialism holds that the mind is nothing more than the brain, and that mental events, including acts of knowledge, are simply the byproduct of chemical reactions in the brain. In using mundane right view to counter these beliefs, the Buddha's main argument was that materialism, as a subset of annihilationism, provided no motivation to abandon unskillful actions and adopt skillful ones, and so it neglected the primary responsibility of any teaching worth the name, that it provide the basis for thinking in terms of what should and shouldn't be done. If everything were just material elements, no action would matter at all. At the same time, implicit in the Buddha's rejection of materialism are 5 main points crucial to the practice of the path to the end of suffering. 1. Because experience at the 6 senses is shaped by intentions, the causal principle governing experience is not mechanical. Ooh, can't wait to comment on this juiciness. 2, the quality of the intention behind an action, skillful or not, can determine the nature of the action's result. 3, I'm gonna stop because I don't want to overwhelm myself or you. So let's just stop here and kind of take a look at these first 2, and then we'll go on and kind of look at the final 3 that represent, Buddha's 5 main points, crucial points to the practice to end suffering. Okay, so 1, right? Because experience at the 6 senses is shaped by intentions, the causal principle governing experience is not mechanical. Far be it from me to think that I have any solutions or answers or even really anything to add to the conversation that's already been had around whether or not we're mechanical beings or we're kind of embodied sensate beings. And here the Buddha argues, well, how can we be mechanical if we actually have some autonomy in shaping our reality? So this sounds radical, right? There will be, I don't even know if anybody really listens to this much, but, hypothetically, let's say that somebody listened to this and they heard this, and it just sounds crazy town, right? It doesn't sound reasonable at all, to suggest that you could actually have any control whatsoever over causes and conditions, Yeah, so, Buddha says that we have a role to play. We're not just automatons. Buddhism says no. Intention is key. It's key factor in the chain of dependent origination. And I'll drop some information about what that is in the Discord channel. But, you may already know, right? I think a lot of people in the Discord server are, they're learning a lot about a lot of different religions just by being there and participating in the conversation. But yeah, I don't like the word victim. We are on the karmic wheel, Again, not to revisit, we are in the section of rebirth, but in Buddhism, this idea that not just our own past lives, but the lives of, within our ancestry, right? And again, I'm not going to comment on that because, again, it's foreign to my my upbringing, and I'm very skeptical. But again, I keep my mind open. In other words, I don't need to. Buddhism is the middle way, and one way for me to think about the middle way is to think about, like, because I've heard this before, and I really like it. It's an easy, simple kind of piece of imagery or visualization to hang on to. A lot of us are black and white thinkers, but the middle way doesn't live in the black and it doesn't live in the white. The middle way lives in the gray. And I think that most Homo sapiens have a pretty hard time with that because of our ego. We need to be right. Why do we need to be right? Well, because our entire identity depends upon it. Everything we believe we are is contingent upon us being right, our worldview being right, our religious faith being right, our skepticism or atheism being right, our progressivism or conservatism being right, our ideological identifications being right. Everything is hanging on that and those stories. But anyway, I'll get moving. I'll keep it moving. So yeah, number 2, right? Going back to number 2, the quality of the intention behind an action, skillful or not, can determine the nature of the action's result. And again, this means that we have some agency. Now, this doesn't mean that the agency is going to be well earned, right? And I've talked about this before a lot. And I don't want to kind of keep repeating over and over and over again, because I've already spent so much time talking about what the Buddha had to say. And then so does Bhikkhu, right? Go back and look at the introduction, go up and read up on what does fabrication mean in Buddhism? What does that mean? The fabricated state, the fabricated mind. Ask ChatGPT. Just say, talk to me, robot, about, what some of these ideas mean. And you've heard me talk a lot about, conditioning. And neuroscientists and child psychologists and biologists and evolutionary scientists, and I know science isn't particularly popular right now. That's because, once again, we're black and white thinkers, right? We like to throw the baby out with the bathwater so that we can feel safe. It's an illusion. But you can cultivate, even if you were born to an addicted mother, which to me is just one of the saddest things I can fathom, really. And I don't think I want to talk about it that long, because if I do, I will get emotional and I'm useless here. But I'll just say the idea of someone being alone and carrying a child and being dependent on something like heroin or crack is just, that's to me what hell is. You want to know what hell looks like? That's hell. So, you take that child, right, who's now born into the world actually a drug addict. Yes, we do know this to be true, right? So, do you blame the mother? Of course not. We've already had this conversation. It's not about blame, right? It's about strategy. Because we could cling, and then at a certain point, you no longer have a say. I would say here in the West, and I can only speak from the Western view, we've had quite a hard heart quite a hard heart. And I would say we still continue to have a pretty hard heart around addiction, not really either wanting to acknowledge or able to acknowledge that it's really just a symptom. It's not some character flaw. What, you're going to tell me that a baby that was born dependent on heroin because her mother was dependent on heroin, that baby has a character flaw? Well, how's that story working out for you? Anyway, I digress, but yeah, so going back. Look at this. Even with nobody here, I just can't even get through a page. So, right, again, the Buddha says, hey, we're not mechanical because for some of us, conditions might be riper for us, and for others, it might be hard fought and hard won. And again, in Buddhism, and again, this is where I'm way out of my area of knowledge, there are teachings from what I have heard and that I'm sure we'll get to here that suggest that, you know, in terms of our karma, you know, we don't, I don't want to get too far off the rails on this because I just don't know how you could prove either one. You know, if it's karma, then we can't fix it because of karma. But then if you're saying that we can fix it, you know, it's too, I'm not going to die on that hill either because I don't know and neither do you. So at least, I mean, if you can show me proof, great. I already told you what I need to believe it. Or I need subjective experience, which is why I meditate every day. But yeah, you know, he's pretty straightforward. We're not mechanical because if you find out for yourself, then you'll find out that you can actually cultivate an ability to train the mind. And then once you've cultivated that ability to train the mind, you actually have some space and you can be more intentional in how you interact with the world. And, you know, again, we also know that, you know, I think more than 75% of how humans perceive other humans is through nonverbal communication. So how do people know? Because they sense it. You know, we kind of talked about this last week, you know. Like, how do I know when I've been unskillful? Because I can see the reaction on their face. So I have a couple of options at that point. I can act like I didn't notice it. Pull out my phone. Act like something's important, I have something important to do. Oh yeah, I got something really important to do right now, right? This is really important. And then this is all happening very, very quickly in the mind, right? But you have a couple of options. You don't realize you have options because, you know, you haven't trained the mind. But if you train the mind, then you realize that you have a couple of options, right? Of how you're going to respond. And that's what he's getting at right here, right? That's what he's getting at right here. He's saying we're not machines. We can course correct because you can train the mind to course correct. That's what mindfulness is. So then he gets into number 3. The causes of suffering come from an untrained mind, and they can be ended by training the mind. Well, I don't think I need to repeat that, so there you go. 4, when choosing a course of action, it's in your best interest to include the fact of rebirth into the equation to decide which actions are worth doing and which ones aren't. And this is so great. We had this conversation with a community member last week, right? And he was saying, look, I don't really, you know, believe in rebirth anymore. You know, he was saying I used to. When I first kind of started practicing, you know, Buddhism, I did. And he says, but right now he says, and I think the word he uses, I don't need it. He said, I don't need it. And I understand what he's saying. And I think even the way the Buddha talks about it here, it's like he even kind of admits that it's really just a trick. You know, that it's just a trick, that he's not actually saying, you know, he's just saying, look, unless you have a trick like this, you know, unless you have a trick like wrong view, like, you know, like this idea of, you know, what annihilationism could mean and what materialism could mean, long view, if you actually just entertain for a minute, think of it as like a practical joke, you know, like, no, right? Like, what if they're right? No. And I've heard this used actually for people of all kind of religions, you know, that I've even heard this used in 12-step programs. And if you're really grappling with the second step, you know, came to believe in a power greater than myself to restore me to sanity. The first time I heard that, I walked out the door and didn't come back for another year. So remember, we're not all the same, right? We're not all the same. What I really dig about this, right, is, you know, this idea that he even says it, you know, right here, that look, if you could this could be a good trick. Because if you could kind of contemplate this trick, then you might actually be able to cultivate that urgency, right? You might actually be able to cultivate that urgency. And then again, just speaking for myself, and we're going to get into these later when we get into different views, like right effort, right concentration, right mindfulness. And when you start, and again, remember that Buddhism is not just something that you do on Sundays or, whatever, on Buddhist holidays, that, Buddhism is actually it's not a birthright. It's a Buddhism is an action. It's a plan of action. Yeah. So Buddha is pretty clear about that. So you take the action, you take the actions, and then you kind of see for yourself the other stuff that no one's going to believe you say anyway. So, again, as I said last week, why die on that hill? I don't need to be right. It's all BS. It's turtles all the way down, baby. Okay. And yeah, so yeah, there it is again, right? Hey, if you think about this, then it could be helpful, when you're making decisions. 5, because people are not just made of material elements. They can know through developing powers of concentration, truths about karma and rebirth, as well as the possibility of stepping outside the dimensions of fabrication. There's that word again. This last principle means that it's possible to place trust in the ability of the Buddha and his awakened disciples to provide reliable guidance in these areas. I'm just going to read that again. This last principle means that it's possible to place trust in the ability of the Buddha and his awakened disciples to provide reliable guidance in these areas. And again, the fact that the word trust here is very useful, certainly for me, because if the word faith had been used here, that would have sent off alarm bells, but it doesn't use the word faith. It uses the word trust. And the reason why I can align with the word trust is because of what I know Buddha has said earlier. And also because, when I did discover Buddhism, and, pretty early on, anytime you find, like I'm American, I found Buddhism. Let me think about this. Everybody probably has ordained my age anyways, but I'm an MTV kid. 90s, the early to mid 90s to late 90s. Right. And even back then, but a Westerner, you could find a place to learn about Buddhism. You could find a place, just like you can find churches, right? Just like you can find any place of worship for any number of profound wisdom traditions that Homo sapiens have, continue to put value and hope and faith and trust in. And so, pretty early on, I got the message that, the Buddha, I feel weird about saying the Buddha because Buddha just means awake. So it's like, I'll just say Buddha, a Buddha, said really early on, you really don't have to believe a word I say. He would kind of talk in these weird, I'm right, but that was really appealing to me, right? That, I found through practice, number 5 to be true. And I find through practice, practice kind of moved the needle for me in my I'd say mid 20s, really. By the time I was really kind of like, all right, Sarah, let's get serious. Let's stop screwing around here. And maybe kind of getting a little closer to 30, I really started kind of, yeah. I really saw number 5 for myself. And that's when I pretty much had kind of came to see for myself, not to put this on anybody else. We're not all the same, but I came to see through my own direct experience, number 5 to be true. In other words, I have developed powers of concentration. The karma and rebirth, I have had some pretty wild experiences, but I don't really pay them much mind. And I guess I just learned recently. Thanks, Grandpa Jack. Sorry, you might find out about this and I'll get a call from you. Please stop calling me that. But at any rate, you've been teaching me a lot of things, and you dropped a video recently about, what Zen Buddhists are taught. And it's like, oh yeah, that's kind of how I practice. You don't really get caught up in all of that. That's just not really part of Buddhist practice. But at any rate, you do see for yourself that you have some agency. You're not just some robot, and that the whole, you have zero free will. Yeah, I know. Okay. Again, that's not an argument that I'm interested in having because I've had direct experiences through meditation. Why am I going to argue with someone? It's like, have you meditated? Well, then why, dude? Come back when you've meditated for like a long ass time and your mind explodes, and then we'll have this conversation. Fatalism holds that human actions have no power to shape experience. The Buddha used mundane right view to counter two broad categories of fatalism. On the one hand, some of his contemporaries taught different varieties of what might be called personal fatalism, claiming that experience was determined by a creator God. On the other, there were those who taught impersonal fatalism, claiming that experience was determined by impersonal factors, fate, mechanical laws, or a version of the teaching on karma in which everything in the present was totally determined by past actions. The Buddha denounced all these forms of fatalism, arguing that they denied the possibility that a path of action could yield results, or that it was even possible to choose a path of action to begin with. These views condemned people to continue suffering with no way out. Although they might counsel people to choose to accept their suffering and to learn to embrace it, they don't even provide logical justification for assuming even that much power of choice. Fatalism teaches powerlessness. Mundane right view, empowerment. Oh, yes. Well, this is a whopper for me. This is a whopper. I think I realize that in certain faith traditions, practices like meditation are actually considered evil. And here, I already know I have a target on me already, right? Because this would fly in the face of a lot of faith traditions, right? But, that is kind of what we do. This is kind of how we roll. And this is why it's complicated. This is why you can't just have a normal conversation about it. Like, I don't think that we've gotten to the suttas yet, right? But even in the 12-step program, there are concepts, that kind of, speak to the same idea that is also in Buddhism. And I'm not acquainted with other traditions, but I bet you that it exists in other traditions as well. I bet you that it does. Because I'm not so arrogant as to presume that there's only one way. That's right, you heard me. My comments are off. But why would you want to double down? Why would you want to hitch your cart to a horse that disempowers you of any autonomy? Why would you do that? And the reason is because you've been conditioned. That's what this whole thing is about. That is what fabrication means. I feel really lucky, I think, the way that I grew up because of the way I grew up, I never lived anywhere longer than a year. And so I would live in a place for a year and then I would move across the state or I would go somewhere else and it would be completely starting over every year starting over. And, at first it was hard. And it was hard when I was younger. It was hard. But, as I got older and I reflected on it, I'm not saying it's better or worse. I'm just saying that what it did afford me is how scary it is to change, to leave, to start over, to go somewhere else. And if you've been somewhere your whole life, we're tribal animals, I feel like I'm meandering again. I'll just say that, this is why I keep my comments off. I already know that this isn't that Buddhism isn't a popular view in the United States. 1% of Americans practice it. It's not exactly a big shocker to me, but I don't look to other people to tell me what to believe. Deal with it. So I present this as hey, here's an option. Yeah, here's an English translation of the Pāli Canon. Check it out, and if it resonates, right on. All right. Let's see. Yeah, well, yeah, so, yeah, I agree with Buddha. It's like, why would you tell people that they have zero? You know what that sounds like to me? People who want to keep power. That's what that sounds like to me. Why else? Why else would you be keeping, why else would you try to keep that from people? Unless you didn't want them to have what you had or what you believed you had, in which case you're not Buddhist, so get back on your mat, yo. So that's what I have to say about fatalism. Anyway, moving on. The Buddha also argued against a fatalistic interpretation of karma. And again, this is kind of getting on once again to what I just said, you know, these ideas that we hold, right, about this kind of doomsday, like, it's all preordained and you have zero, you know, agency, and you may as well just whatever, F it, because you have no stake or no claim and no agency. The Buddha also argued against a fatalistic interpretation of karma, in which past bad actions inevitably led to hell, on the grounds that anyone who has acted unskillfully in the past, on hearing such teachings, would immediately be thrown into despair. That despair would then weaken their ability to gain release from the cycle of karma. In contrast, mundane right view, in showing that actions tend to give certain results, opens the way for people not to fall into remorse, but to recognize the error of their past ways and to resolve on 1, showing restraint in the future, and 2, developing an attitude of goodwill for all beings. These resolves will then strengthen their ability to act skillfully in the future, which will be for their long-term welfare and happiness, not only now, but also in the next lifetime. And this comes from Sutta 69 and Sutta 139. And once again, if you're more secular, then you can think of this as a trick. Put this into action for myself so that I can see the dividends in my own life. If what Buddha's experience is saying is true, right? So he's having this experience, and then he's presenting these teachings, right? This is what this is why, you know, the Buddha would warn, don't take the practice out of the teachings, because otherwise, great, so you're meditating, but what are you meditating on? You know, and we've kind of already talked about this, you know, it's like, and this is where you have less agency than you think, right? And that's that paradox that we keep talking about. And not just me, you know, but anybody who talks about Buddhism will talk about that paradox, right? Buddha recognized the paradox. And he's sure he's not the only one, you know. So, but if you can hold this idea that, and this is also in the 12 steps, okay? Look, I can take a fourth step, look at my behavior, see where I've hurt myself, see where I've hurt people that I love and loved. And then there's other things that I don't want to talk about because of the principles of that program that I want to respect. But I'll just say that, you know, we can think about that. We can recognize it. We can cultivate, and this is where you can bring in other aspects of the path, which I certainly do, right? And this is where I can bring in things like, you know, like right mindfulness, and, you know, metta in particular for me, self metta, you know, and there's so much here. There's just so much here, okay? But this idea that if you don't give people an out, well, they may as well just put trigger warning. Then they may as well, you know, just put a gun in their mouth right now, because you haven't given them any hope, right? And I just have to tell you, if you are listening, it's not just a trick, because I know what I used to be like, and it wasn't just Buddhism for me, okay? There were actually quite a few interventions that I used that helped me profoundly in my life. And today, although you know, in the last couple of years, I'm not exactly where I want to be, I am a happy person. And that wasn't just Buddhism. You know, there's a lot going on there, other things that help me as well, you know, as well as therapy, you know, for a while, you know, like the talk therapy stuff. But this idea of, you know, recognizing, and maybe you can't recognize the behavior yet because, you know, if you come from a lot of trauma, well, then you might be living in kind of a, which we talked about before, you know, you kind of might be living in a fight, flight, freeze kind of mode. You know, believe me, I understand. I lived there for quite a long time. I'm well acquainted with that place. the upside down place, right? I often wondered, the Duffel brothers who made Stranger Things, I often wondered if the upside down place was kind of reflecting that, was supposed to be a representation of that, well, anyway, I digress. But I'm talking about the show Stranger Things, by the way. Sorry. That was a very kind of, from an international perspective, maybe a very regional kind of reference. Stranger Things is an American show. It's very popular in the United States. And I think it's because it plays with a lot of archetypes that we all can relate to. And so anyway, so it's just not skillful, right? It's just not skillful to say, hey, you're going to live because of karma, because of the rules of karma. Maybe you had a great uncle that was, murdered and pillaged and raped. And so now you're going to get to live in the upside down place for the rest of your life. And there's nothing you can do about it because of karma. You have no choice. You're trapped on the karmic wheel. Yeah. Have a nice day. And as he puts here, just kind of what the best that you can do now is just to tell your people just to deal with it, right? Just learn how to accept your lot in life. Some cultures, it's okay to rape young girls, right? Oh, what do you mean, young girls? Just accept your lot in life. You too were trapped on the wheel of karma, young girl. Just accept your fate. I'm slipping one in there. Fuck you. Right? Yeah, that's just not wise. That's just not wise. In rejecting fatalism, mundane right view also allows for the objective benefit of feeling gratitude for the help provided by others. Yay! Recognizing that they had the choice to provide that help or not. Calling all narcissists. No one owes you anything. Right? Including your friends. Your parents don't owe you anything unless legally they do. I was out of the house at 18. Once you're 18, they don't owe you anything. You might think they owe you something. You be wrong. So this idea that we can recognize, right? We can recognize that we can cultivate gratitude. That, hey, you know what? I have a lot in my life to be grateful for. Yes, I can also choose to stay in the upside down world and meditate on how crap my life is and how, I think a large part of what I'm seeing culturally, at least online, is they've kind of decided to double down on that view. Well, hey, guess what? That's wrong view. That's wrong view from where I'm standing. How is that helpful? How's that working out for you? Huh? Is it? Bet it isn't. I bet it isn't. Okay. All right. Moving along. Okay, the denial of causality also provides no room for a path of action that will yield results. And so the Buddha attacked it for the same reasons. Because mundane right view asserts the principle that actions tend to have certain consequences. It denies both fatalism on the one hand and a view of total randomness on the other. This perspective allows for the possibility of developing skills. Because in a world of randomness, no patterns of cause and effect could be mastered to the point of skill in a world of fatalism. I mean, think about that. That's just logical. No choice of what to do and what not to do to develop a skill would be available at all, right? In a world of tendencies, though, skills can be developed by learning to read those tendencies and directing them to your desired ends. Do you see what he's saying here? Just think about what he's saying here for a second. In a world of tendencies, though, skills can be developed by learning to read those tendencies and directing them to your desired results. Will you get it right every time? Absolutely not. Absolutely not. You should read my Rate Your Professor reviews, and maybe you will, and I don't care. I was far from a perfect professor. I have a hot temper. I'm a passionate, bam, passionate person. Are you going to get it right all the time? No, I've already talked about this. I've already talked about the comic seeds ripening in my temper and how I used to punch dogs in the face and kids when I was a kid if they effed with me, right? I have no control over that. I didn't then and I don't now. But what do I have control over? I can train. So can you. Train. There's that edge again, right? There's that edge again. You know, I was teaching someone this pose, and I don't want to give you all the details because it's not mine to give away. You know, again, drop a little, Mark Walsh, Embodiment Unlimited, Keck. I swear he's not paying me. It's just that I did it, and I'm really enjoying it. And I have a couple clients now, and I'm going on to do what they call the toolkit. Where I've learned a couple of poses, and now I want to, increase my toolkit. I want to have more poses. Although the ones that I learned are like enough. So far, they've just been more than enough, which Mark said would happen. But what I oftentimes when I'm thinking about things like this, that edge in Buddhism, I'm thinking about the no pose, and I won't say why. Again, I'll just say that the no pose as Mark teaches it, and perhaps he learned. I'm not exactly sure how the no pose came to be. I know that Mark also has a lot of mentors. Mark, just go online and look up, Mark Walsh, Embodiment Unlimited, look up no pose, and you'll see what I mean by this. You'll see what I mean about how this is kind of mirrors the no pose. There's this radical, anyway, I'm going on and on, but these are wrong views for this reason, right? We're in chapter 3. We're exploring right view. Right view is one of the 8 rights in the Eightfold Path. The Eightfold Path is the backbone of Buddhism. It's the backbone of Buddhism. These are the wrong views. And so hopefully, hopefully it's making some sense. You may or may not agree with it. Again, I don't try to convince anybody to become a Buddhist or to practice Buddhism. I'm passionate about Buddhism because of what it continues to offer me and how I relate to the physical world. But yeah. There you go. So let's move on to the next one. Eternalism. Eternalism took many forms in the Buddha's time, but the version that has carried over to the present is the belief that there is an essence to each individual, not subject to change. That is either a separate soul or one, and the one, the number 1 is capitalized, right? The one, right? With the changeless ground of the cosmos. The Buddha rejected these views because whatever that essence might be, it would be impervious to the power of action to change. And this comes from DN 1 MN 22. In addition, if your inner essence faces an eternal fate, then that fate cannot depend on your actions, because all actions are by nature limited in scope, and so cannot have the power to create an eternal result. Eternalism thus forces you to look outside of your actions to provide for an eternal happiness, and so would undercut any motivation to act skillfully in all situations. And again, I think this is where you will often see the most kind of, sometimes not playful, sometimes very playful. I would say in a meditation mind, it's always playful, and I'm eternally grateful to meditation mind for that reason. That it is always, almost always a playful skirmish between Buddhists and Hindus. And I think that a lot of it, and again, I don't want to speak out of turn because I am very ignorant about Hinduism. I know a couple of people who practice Hinduism. I really don't, I'm very limited, but I have kind of an outsider's, very kind of vague conception of what it is. And so I know enough to know that this supports the difference. And yeah, I think he's kind of putting it here right now why he considers it to be wrong view. I'm not saying I consider it to be wrong view. I'm really not going to go there. I'm just going to say that I practice Buddhism, and the reason why I don't practice things like the law of attraction, or the reason why I don't practice kind of praying to an outside deity, or kind of channeling and lining it up with it really comes down to language. And we just had this conversation in Meditation Mind today, me and another person who I think, practices a different faith. And we were both saying this very same thing. We were kind of laughing together, through text about how hard it is to even talk about this, because on a certain level, it's like you're kind of saying the same thing. And I think, earlier, if you go back and you look at earlier sections of the book and, talking about the seven chariots and the, the entry points and the, and does it even matter? Again, it comes back to, why are we having this conversation? At least that's what a Buddhist would say, right? We talk less, practice more. 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 Yeah, not a judgment. I'm just kind of, this is what I have been taught in Buddhist tradition. And so the next one he has here for wrong view, and boy, I think that we can wholly recognize that this is very ripe in a global culture right now. Thank goodness. But it's also, Buddha saw the lack of wisdom in it 2,500 years ago as well. He's a practical man. He was a practical man. When I think of Buddha, I think of here's a guy who had a lot of gumption and a lot of courage, because it takes a lot of courage, to kind of sit through your inner demons and the fire of your mind. But he also had this incredible ability to think critically through things, just really kind of say, well, if I take this idea to its logical conclusion, where does that leave me, and does that make sense? You know what I mean? And that's what I like about my limited experience. I mean, Marcus Aurelius, that's about it, but my limited experience with the Stoics, I appreciate that about them too, is kind of the practical nature of them. But at any rate, so what's another wrong view in Buddhism? Racism is. Racism in the Buddhist time found its prime expression in the beliefs of the Brahmins that they alone were worthy of respect and that they alone could reach the highest spiritual attainments. The Buddha used a mundane right view to argue that virtue and spiritual attainments were not connected to caste or race, and that Brahmins, like everyone else, were capable of planting either good or bad seeds in their karmic fields. Also, he noted that the karmic fields of Brahmins were not free of seeds that could yield bad results. Yeah, so eat that. Okay, I added that part. And that people of other castes were not devoid of good seeds in their karmic fields. In addition, anyone, regardless of caste, can act on skillful intentions and reap their results. It's for this reason that the path to the end of suffering contains no factors that depend on caste, class, or race. And we've talked about this before. And again, I only have access to what I have access to, and I'm, very much not an academic. But we've already kind of talked about gender or sex or the role of that here. And we've already talked about the historical Buddha, and we've already seen in the suttas that, in the early Pāli Canon text, nun Dhammadita, I think I got her name right, she appears, right, in this book, which means that she, historically, at least as far as we know, appeared in the Pāli Canon, which means that Buddha was pretty open-minded, right, about women as well, and taught women with men. As well as having male students, so, he was a pretty radically open-minded dude. 2,500 years ago, he recognized that racism leads to suffering, and he said, this is where I depart from my Hindu tradition, and I say no. Anyone can access. Anyone has agency to at least begin to cultivate, and again, and this is one of my favorite parts about Buddhism, that lack of elitism, right? And I think in Christianity, what's that saying in Christianity? Well, I'm going to kill it, but the sense is, only the person who is free of sin should throw stones, right? And that's kind of what I think he's saying here is, look, maybe I came up as a young man kind of being told that, I am of high caste, I'm in the warrior caste, and, this is, I can attain these things because of my birth caste, and that if I wasn't in this caste, I would not have access to it. That is very racist. And, so he was like, hey, that's why you'll hear often Buddhism was considered to be a universal religion. It was like, hey, man, it doesn't matter. Please, that is so arrogant and egotistical to think. And now now maybe you do or you don't look back and laugh at that and go, oh, wow. And maybe you don't, in which case, that's why you can't comment on my podcast. Okay, so let's move on. So we're now on page 124, top of 124, from mundane to transcendent right view. Mundane right view provides both a conceptual background for transcendent right view and the motivation for wanting to develop it. Urgency, urgency, urgency. On the conceptual level, as we have already seen, mundane right view counters the many forms of wrong view that would make the path to the end of suffering impossible. Right? So we already talked about that. If you think there's no purpose and nothing at all, it's all just then why would you be motivated? And I think we're seeing that right now in the world, right? It's like, why should I get off the couch? Why should I do it? It doesn't matter, right? Well, that's not particularly skillful, and I think we can see why. At the same time, it divides experience into 4 categories: skillful action, pleasant result; unskillful action, painful result. These 4 categories, when refined, turn into the 4 noble truths, respectively: the path to the end of suffering, the end of suffering, the origination of suffering, and suffering. And because mundane right view locates the roots of skillful and unskillful actions in the mind, it lays the groundwork for the underlying principle of the 4 noble truths, that both the origination of suffering and the path to its cessation are to be found in the mind as well. And isn't that just incredibly hopeful? It's just incredibly hopeful. And I think as we continue on in the Eightfold Path to kind of dig even further into the richness of this, because then you start getting into ideas like impermanence and non-attachment, and why might that be valid? Well, maybe you could you put yourself in and again, if this is you, then may your heart be open. I'll just say that, and if it's not, then okay. Let's say that you did something really, 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 kind of objectively bad. Like maybe you walked up to somebody that's on the side of the road just standing there, and you just assassinated them. You might be able to convince yourself, we're pretty good at like telling ourselves stories and rationalizing, but we're also very embodied. And so I'd argue as an embodiment coach that it'll come around to bite you. You do behavior like that, maybe you can rationalize with your cognitive mind that what you did was okay, they had it coming. And you'll tell yourself all kinds of stories to reinforce that you're right, but it'll show up in other places, I'd argue, and so would Buddhism. So we have an out, and if we're not hung up on results because we see the impermanence, then the game, and it is a game to a certain degree, then the game becomes the path itself. It's not a journey, it's kind of a fun game. I tell that a lot, especially to people that I coach, because sometimes when we can just lighten up about things, it's another thing I love about Meditation Mind. They get together once a week, and maybe even more, I don't know, but I know at least once a week they get together, and there's like well over 100 people that sign up for this on Discord, and they meditate in pain or whatever that game is. I'm sorry, I'm a little bit out of it. That's great. That's great. It's, I would say at a certain point, you can't game all of it. This is not an easy path, and adding contraptions and devices is actually not going to get you to where you want to go if where you're claiming you want to go is to path to Radhaga, right? At a certain point, you're going to have to put all that crap down. But, it's a great entry point. And I'll say that although I don't use contraptions now, I gamify my practice in other ways. And like, for instance, I think I mentioned before that Joseph Goldstein taught me this trick, and I love it, where it might have been him or John Kabat-Zinn, I can't remember who, but they said when they're doing really long sits, they'll play a little game with themselves. They didn't call it a game, but to my mind, this is a mental game. It's a trick, right? Where, when the mind starts to say, oh God, I can't sit anymore. I'm like, oh, I'm just going to die. I'm in so much pain. And he would say, okay, I would note that, and then I would keep sitting, and then I wasn't allowed to get up until my mind tried to convince me of that a third time. Now that's really radical, but that is what we are doing in Buddhism when we're working with meditation. And so, these little tricks that you can kind of bring in to kind of help with that. And so here he's saying, hey, I'm telling you, he's saying, I'm telling you, the path to suffering is the mind, and the path to cessation of suffering is the mind. I'm telling you, but you don't have to listen to me. I'm right, but you don't have to listen to me. Just do it. 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 Right? Just try it. Just try it. Don't give up. Don't give up. Just stay on the road to Radhaga. As for motivation, mundane right view provides reasons for people to attempt a life of skillful action. Right? So we were just talking about this. And in this way empowers them to begin turning their lives in the direction of less suffering. I was listening to a YouTube podcast that I like a lot, and it's a father-son team, and one I believe is a Buddhist and a psychologist, and the other one is not a Buddhist. I think he's atheist, secular, and he's also a psychologist. And this was kind of coming up, this idea right here, that when the father was saying, the father was trying to explain something, and he was saying, when you train regularly, right? Not, like, no, seriously, think about what the word train means. Like, train. When you train, then when the mind begins to produce, boy, this is such tough stuff. And again, this is why I don't allow comments, because it's way too complicated. And what we have a tendency to do online is to make everything fall into easy categories. And this is some really ancient esoteric crap here. Anytime you're getting into ancient wisdom traditions, there is nothing black or white about it. It is all gray and tones and shades of gray. But we're really getting into the weeds here of some people can really be addicted to their pain, and they'll try to suck you into it. And they're not I shouldn't say that. Let me do a course correction on my word choice, which was not skillful. Unbeknownst to them, so maybe beknownst to them. I don't know. There's plenty of videos out there about psychopathology. We talked about this last week, about narcissism and all of the different things that people will do to get what they want. And some of them are, make them go to jail for the rest of their life or whatever, right? Humans are wild. But this is really where the rubber meets the road here, in Buddhism, is that you've got to provide an avenue for people to find the exit, right? Where's the eject button? Where's the exit? And I don't mean suicide. No. In fact, in Buddhism, that would be a terrible idea. Think about that. Why would you do that? So what? You're going to start over in the same, right? So again, do you see why? Even if you can just imagine that this is true, you could be like, oh yeah, that would really suck. I'm really unhappy right now. If these guys are right and I just end my life right now, you mean I'm going to have to come back and be this unhappy all again? I realize but all we do is tell stories, people, right? We're storytellers. So if that's a useful story, tell it. Okay. So I'm just going to keep on reading here, because I'm don't want to go too far over, and I'm already at the top of the hour, but I want to just very close to ending where I want to end. However, it also shows that the pleasant levels of rebirth are precarious, and that it's possible, even when reborn on those levels, to have bad seeds in your karmic field that could yield intense suffering down the line. In these ways, mundane right view can encourage you to set your sights higher than a pleasant lifetime now, or good rebirths in the future, to aim at the more secure safety of gaining release from rebirth entirely. And so this goes back to what we were talking about last week, that there will be some people that will not need these tricks. For whatever reason, some people are, again, go back and watch the videos on, seriously, if you're really interested in some of the stuff we've been talking about the last couple of weeks, just go back in that Discord server and watch some of these videos about psychopathology, psychopathy, I can never say it, but also the, people who have natural altruism, this idea of people who, their heart's just full to help. Their heart is just full to help. And I have absolutely met people like that in my life, and they don't always look the way you think you would. You know, I remember I was doing this documentary project in Las Vegas, and there was this guy. So under the streets of Las Vegas, in the Strip, the great irony of this, right? Under the streets of Las Vegas and the Strip are miles and miles of sewage pipes that have been there for a long time. And lots of homeless people live there, and a lot of them have extreme, severe dependency on methamphetamines and other, you know, street drugs. And this particular person who lost an eye fighting somebody else's war, you know, he goes down there like a couple times a week, brings him food, checks up on him. Now, in some traditions, you know, people would say that's terrible, and that's okay. That's a view. That's a view. You know, we don't really harbor views like that, and you know, there's this constant kind of question, and there's no, and it's not about guilt either. There's those aren't Eastern ideas. Okay, guilt, all that stuff, that's not in there. I don't even know if what I said just made sense, but this idea of the motivation, you know, that it doesn't, even if you follow this whole line that, you know, people who are really, really wealthy in this life are wealthy because they have good karma, well, it's irrelevant in Buddhism. I mean, and he's saying why right here, you know, I see it happen all the time, you know, in Hollywood, you know, these really wealthy people who are admired and revered, and they have this great pulpit, this great position to do great service, and they just harm. You know, you see them go into jail for trafficking little girls or children, or sexually violating young people so that they can have a shot. So yeah, you don't get no free ride in Buddhism. That's just not a part of how it works. You know, it's a much more practical kind of karma, man. You get what you deserve. Not like that, but kind of like that. You know, it may not manifest itself in, you know, but it could manifest in other things. You know, I have a lot of pain in my body right now, and I don't need to share with you why I do, but I have a pretty good idea of why. But I don't know you. Why would I tell you that? Right? But these things can manifest in our body, you know. So anyway, I'm going to keep on going. Here we go. This twofold dynamic is illustrated in a discourse that the suttas call the graduated or gradual discourse. And I'm going to do my best. Anupubikata. Sorry if I got that wrong. That the Buddha reportedly gave to many of his listeners as a way of preparing their minds to be receptive to the Four Noble Truths. And yes, I remember when I just started learning about Buddhism, and yes, there were things that my teachers did to help us kind of really contemplate and really kind of let it kind of marinate, if you will, in the ideas that are layered in the idea of the Four Noble Truths. The discourse began with the topic of giving and virtue. Giving covers the act of choosing freely to share your resources with others. The freedom of choice here is the essential element in the joy of giving, which is why the Buddha never placed restrictions on where a gift should be given. And this comes from Sutta 71 through 72. Similarly with virtue, it's the free choice to abstain from causing harm. From what the suttas report of the Buddha's teachings on these topics, when he discussed them in the graduated discourse, he probably focused on the happy rewards they gave in his life, such as self-esteem, living in harmony, and earning the respect of others, Sutta 74 and Sutta 82. As the next step in the graduated discourse, these discussions would be followed by a discussion of the third topic, the sensual pleasures that constitute the rewards of giving and virtue in heaven. If his listeners had not already developed these skillful actions, the Buddha would often stop here, with the encouragement that his listeners develop them and taste the rewards, both inner and outer, that can come from them here and now. In this way, he affirms the principle that the desire for happiness, if conducted in a blameless way, is neither futile nor something to be ashamed of. If, however, his listeners were already experienced in giving and virtue, he would discuss the fourth topic, the drawbacks of sensuality, the mind's fascination with planning for and fantasizing about sensual pleasures, even heavenly ones, Sutta 147. At this point, if his listeners admitted the truth of this point, they would be receptive to the fifth topic, the teaching that renunciation of sensuality would be a state not of deprivation, but of true safety. Ooh, interesting. And this comes from SS 97 through 101. In getting his listeners to look positively at renunciation, though, the Buddha was not preparing to tell them that the pursuit of happiness was futile. Instead, he was encouraging them to continue that pursuit by aiming it toward a higher happiness, beyond the level of sensuality. It was at this point that he would teach them the map to that higher happiness in the form of the Four Noble Truths. And I do want to stop here because we've now come to the end of this section, and the next section is Transcendent Right View. And yeah, you know, I don't know how much I can tell you about this other than I do hope that you'll, if you're in the Meditation Mind server, that you will give a listen to the videos I've dropped from who I call Grandpa Jack, because I can't remember his full name right now. But, you know, again, I did drop some videos about how he has talked about, you know, being a Zen monk, and now he's a lay Zen practitioner, and he's got a girlfriend, and, you know, that means he does the sex stuff. And, you know, he's a very gracious and honest man from what I can tell. And yeah, I'm just going to leave it there and say this has been lovely. I really enjoyed the reading. I've also actually missed doing it in Discord, even if no one's there. I know that sounds weird, but it's like I just appreciate that community. If you're listening, thank you so much for listening. And we'll start up again on the next episode at the bottom of page 125, beginning with Transcendent Right View. Take care.